The sound of crutches striking the polished floor echoed like thunder in the Denver courthouse, and every head turned as I entered. My name is Naomi Carter. I am 27 years old, and the weight of every scar on my body walked in with me that morning. My long sleeves clung to the skin that had been burned almost beyond recognition, but I knew I could not hide forever. My face still bore traces of the fire, and the hush that swept across the room told me everyone saw it. My sister Madison sat only a few rows away. Her lips were curled in that familiar smirk, the one she wore when she thought she had already won. My mother Donna kept her hand clasped tightly on the arm of my stepfather Harold, both of them stiff and composed as if this was just another family gathering. But when I moved closer, when the judge had not yet entered, and silence made every sound sharper, I stopped. Slowly, deliberately, I rolled my sleeve back. Gasps spread like a wave. The raw, uneven skin of my arm, burned and scarred, permanently glistened under the fluorescent lights. A murmur of shock filled the gallery. Madison's face turned white, her smirk shattered, and she half rose to her feet before collapsing back into the wooden bench. Harold, usually so firm and domineering, clutched at the side rail as though his knees could not bear his weight. Donna whispered something to him, her lips trembling, but her eyes stayed locked on me. I saw the fear, the disbelief, and I felt a tremor of power I had never known in that household. For a moment, all the years of being the unwanted child, the ignored daughter, seemed to crumble. I was not invisible anymore. I was undeniable. Madison finally burst out, her voice slicing the silence. She shouted, "She was not supposed to live!" The words rang out, and the gallery erupted into whispers. She was not supposed to live. In that single sentence, the lie that had been carefully covered for months cracked open in front of everyone. The judge had not even spoken yet, and already the world knew this was not an accident. Every memory of that night surged into my chest. I remembered the smell of burning fabric, the choking smoke, Madison's voice so close to my ear, whispering, "Better off, dead." I remembered Harold standing in the doorway, not moving, not helping his voice cold as he barked, "Do not call the police!" I remembered Donna's frantic hands throwing a blanket over me, but her refusal to dial 911. The way she looked at me not as her injured child, but as a problem to conceal. The memory slammed against the present moment, and I had to grip the crutch tighter, but I kept my head high. The courtroom audience shifted uncomfortably, unable to tear their eyes from my arm from the visible evidence of what had been done. Some people leaned forward, whispering to each other, their voices carrying disbelief and horror. I caught a man shake his head, muttering to the woman beside him, "This was no kitchen accident." They could all see that now. The scars screamed louder than any words. And in that moment, I knew that this trial was not just about contracts or money. It was about survival. It was about a family that had chosen cruelty over love. My heart pounded so hard I thought the whole room could hear it. For years, I had been quiet, trying to earn approval that never came. Now, the silence belonged to me. The judge entered, then the gavel striking once, and all rose to their feet. I struggled but stood with them, every muscle in my burned leg aching. I looked straight ahead, refusing to glance at Madison again because I already knew I had shaken her. I had already made her break her mask. I felt the fire of that night still on my skin, but I also felt the strength it had forged. This courtroom was my battlefield, and I was not here to beg for sympathy. I was here to claim justice. The judge's eyes moved over the room, pausing briefly on me. Perhaps she had already been briefed, perhaps not, but in that second I saw recognition, a silent acknowledgement that my presence alone carried weight. My lawyer, Clara, seated beside me, leaned in and whispered, "Just breathe. We have everything we need." But I did not need her reassurance. I had the truth carved into my skin, a truth Madison could not erase, no matter how many lies she had told. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, and I let the silence stretch. I wanted Madison to feel it, to feel the walls closing in, to feel every eye upon her. The courtroom was not just a place of law today. It was the place where a family's betrayal would be unmasked. My voice had been taken from me when flames licked across my body, but now it returned with more force than ever. Inside, I repeated the words I had promised myself while staring at sterile hospital ceilings. I will not stay silent. I will not let them erase me. And as the judge began to call the session to order, I knew the trial was more than legal proceedings. It was the turning point of my life. If it were you sitting there with scars that would never fade facing the people who tried to bury you alive, would you choose to forgive, or would you make them face the weight of every choice they had made? Comment below and let the debate begin. I was born Naomi Carter, the second daughter in a household where love was measured not by fairness but by favoritism. And from the earliest days of my life, I understood that my existence was a shadow cast against the brightness of my older sister, Madison. She was 2 years older, polished from childhood with compliments and rewards, the golden child in the eyes of my mother, Donna. Every milestone she reached was celebrated with balloons, cakes, and endless praise, while mine were brushed aside as if they barely counted. I remember winning a school spelling bee when I was 10, holding my certificate in trembling hands, excited to show it off, only to have my mother glance at it and murmur, "That is nice, honey, but did you hear about Madison's art project?" She painted such a beautiful picture. The shift of attention was instant, absolute, and I felt invisible again. That was the rhythm of my childhood. My stepfather Harold entered the picture when I was 9. He was tall, with a voice that carried authority even when he was quiet. He had a way of filling a room that made you shrink without him ever raising a hand. At first, I thought he might bring balance, that he might notice me where my mother never did, but his attention turned quickly to control. Rules in the house were sharp and unbending. If I left my shoes near the door, he called me careless. If Madison left hers, he called her busy and important. If I raised my voice, I was disrespectful. If Madison raised hers, she was passionate. These double standards stacked up like bricks around me until I felt caged. I learned to keep my head down, to do my homework quietly, to avoid confrontation, but even silence was not enough. Harold did not need me to misbehave to remind me of my place. A look was enough, a heavy silence at the dinner table when I spoke, followed by my mother redirecting the conversation toward Madison. My mother, Donna, had once been a woman I longed to please. She had a gentle smile for outsiders, the kind that charmed neighbors and church friends, but for me, she had a coldness that could freeze a room. Her affection was rationed out, reserved for Madison. If Madison got a promotion or a trophy, Donna told everyone she knew. When I earned good grades or volunteered extra hours at school, she told me, "Do not brag, Naomi, it is not attractive." What she meant was that it was not attractive for me because if Madison had done the same, she would have shouted it from the rooftops. The hurt of being overlooked shaped me in ways I did not understand until much later. I pushed myself harder, studying late into the night, excelling in science and later nursing. Every time they ignored me, I thought, one day they will see. One day I will achieve something so undeniable that even they cannot dismiss it. That determination was my engine, but it was also my burden. Living under their roof meant enduring Madison's constant digs. She knew she was the favored one, and she wielded it like a weapon. When we were children, she stole my toys, smirking as my mother scolded me for not sharing. As teenagers, she sabotaged my friendships, whispering lies that turned classmates against me. When I confronted her, she laughed, saying, "You will always be second best, Naomi." She was not wrong in the eyes of our parents. Donna never corrected her. Harold never intervened. They allowed her cruelty to bloom unchecked, and it grew with her into adulthood. The house we lived in felt less like a home and more like a stage where roles had been assigned. Madison was the star. I was the understudy who would never get the spotlight, and my mother was the audience who only applauded one performance. Harold was the director, stern and detached, making sure the play ran the way he wanted. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Every time I swallowed my pride, every time I smiled through the hurt, a part of me hardened. I remember being 17, applying for a scholarship that I won after months of effort, and when the letter came, I burst into tears of joy. I handed it to my mother, expecting maybe a rare moment of pride, but she skimmed it and said flatly, "That is good. Now go help your sister with her college portfolio." In that moment, I realized I would never be enough for her. Yet I still kept trying. I became a nurse because I wanted to help others, but also because I wanted something that was undeniably mine. Nursing required compassion, endurance, and intelligence. It required all the things I had honed by being invisible, all the qualities no one in my family recognized, but which strangers in hospitals did. When patients thanked me when doctors respected my input, I felt a validation I never received at home. That validation became my lifeline. Meanwhile, Madison's path was smooth. She became a project manager at a bank, a job she flaunted at every family dinner, and Donna glowed with pride. Harold nodded approvingly, as if she was the embodiment of their values. I sat quietly listening to them toast her successes while my contributions were ignored. Even when I worked double shifts to cover for sick colleagues, even when my supervisors praised me, it was nothing in their eyes. They believed banking was prestigious, nursing was just service. These years of imbalance created a fracture that deepened with every holiday, every gathering where I sat as an outsider at my own family's table. The toxicity was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silence that cut the deepest. Birthdays, forgotten phone calls, unanswered encouragement withheld. I carried the absence of their support like a weight around my neck, but I refused to let it drag me down completely. There was still a stubborn spark in me that believed I could rise above it. That spark grew when I began working on a medical research project, a diagnostic algorithm that could save lives. I poured every ounce of my energy into it, coding after long hospital shifts, reading journals late at night, testing and refining. It was my creation, my chance to stand on my own. And in the back of my mind, though, I hated to admit it, I dreamed of the moment I could present it to my family and finally see recognition in their eyes. I believed foolishly, perhaps, that success could bridge the gap. I believed that money and achievement might force them to acknowledge me. What I did not realize was that in a toxic family, success does not heal envy. It feeds it. And Madison was watching, always watching her smile tight whenever I mentioned work. Her questions sharp and probing, her eyes glinting with something darker than mere rivalry. Looking back, I can see the warning signs. The way Donna dismissed my project as boring while praising Madison's routine bank meetings as impressive. The way Harold questioned whether my work was realistic, hinting that I should focus on supporting my sister instead. They were setting the stage for what was to come. They were reinforcing the narrative that Madison was the rightful heir to admiration and I was expendable. At the time, I clung to hope. I told myself families could change, that deep down they must love me. But the truth was written long before in every dismissal, every sneer, every silence. I was not the daughter they cherished. I was the daughter they endured. And that reality was about to turn deadly once envy and greed collided with opportunity. The night I held the signed contract in my hands, I felt a rush of pride so powerful it nearly lifted me off the ground. $2 million a research agreement that would fund years of development for the diagnostic algorithm. I had poured my soul into a recognition not only of my skills, but of my persistence. I walked out of the sleek glass tower in downtown Denver, trembling with excitement, the city lights glinting like stars that had finally bent low enough for me to touch. This was the moment I had waited for, the moment I believed would finally change everything. As I drove home, gripping the steering wheel tight, I rehearsed how I would say it. I imagined my mother's eyes widening, imagined Harold's stiff nod of approval, imagined Madison's shock turning to reluctant pride. For once, I thought they would have to see me not as the shadow, but as someone who had carved out her own light. I parked in front of the suburban house I had grown up in, the place that had never felt like home, but still pulled me back out of some stubborn need for connection. My heart raced as I walked up the familiar steps and opened the door. The smell of coffee hung in the air, the hum of the refrigerator in the background. Madison sat at the kitchen table, her posture straight, her hair glossy, her expression cool. She looked up when I entered, and there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. But I pushed forward, holding up the folder, my voice breaking with emotion as I said, "I did it, Madison." I landed the contract, $2 million for the algorithm. I expected her to smile, to share at least a flicker of my joy. Instead, her lips curled not in happiness, but in disdain. "Your algorithm," she snapped, her tone dripping with venom. You mean the one I helped oversee, the one I pushed through when you were too naive to know how to handle the meetings. My stomach dropped. I laughed nervously, trying to soften the tension, saying, No, Madison, the code is mine. The sleepless nights, the testing, that was all me. But she stood her chair scraping against the floor, her face only inches from mine. You think you are better than me, do you? She hissed. You think you can just walk in here with your little contract and make me look small? The intensity in her eyes shook me. I had seen her angry before, but this was different. This was not sibling rivalry. This was rage mixed with fear, as if my success threatened to erase her very identity. I backed away, my heart pounding. This is not about you. I tried to reason, my voice shaking. This is about helping patients, about making a difference. But she was not listening. She leaned closer, her breath hot against my face, and spat. You are nothing without me. Nothing. I felt the sting of those words as sharply as if she had struck me. All the years of being dismissed, of being invisible, of being treated as lesser, condensed into that one venomous declaration. I thought of the countless times my achievements had been minimized, and I realized she could not bear to see me succeed on my own. Her fury terrified me, but it also opened my eyes. Madison was not going to celebrate with me. She was going to try to take what was mine. I managed to step past her, clutching the folder tightly to my chest, and moved into the living room where Harold sat watching television. I thought maybe he will acknowledge me. Maybe he will finally see. Harold looked up briefly, his eyes flicking to the contract, then back to the screen. Good for you, he said flatly, as though I had mentioned passing a test in school. His indifference was like a cold slap. My mother entered then, carrying a basket of laundry, her face lighting up not at me, but at Madison. What are you two fussing about? She asked, her tone indulgent. I held up the folder again, desperate, saying, I signed a contract today. A real research deal worth $2 million. Donna's smile faded into a thin line. She set the basket down and said, Do not brag, Naomi. It is not attractive. I felt my chest tighten. That single sentence undid the hours of hard work, the nights of sacrifice. Madison folded her arms, standing taller, and smirked. See, she said softly, even Mom knows. You should be careful. Success can be dangerous if you do not know how to handle it. The warning in her voice sent chills through me. I looked from her to Harold to Donna and realized that not one of them was happy for me. They were united not in pride, but in quiet hostility. My joy drained away, replaced by a heavy dread. I had thought success would build a bridge. Instead, it had built a wall. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the folder, the contract that should have been a celebration. My phone buzzed with messages of congratulations from colleagues, my email filled with notes from partners who were excited to work with me. Out there in the world, I was respected. But in this house, I was still the unwanted child. Worse, I was now a threat. I could feel it in the way Madison glared at me, in the way Harold's words carried no warmth, in the way Donna dismissed me so easily. The spark of jealousy I had seen in Madison's eyes was not small. It was a fire waiting for fuel. And deep down, though I tried to shake it, I knew she would not let this go. The contract represented more than money. It represented independence. It meant I could stand without them, and to a family that thrived on control, that was the ultimate betrayal. I tried to sleep, but my mind replayed Madison's words, You are nothing without me. The venom of it echoed in my ears, louder than the applause of strangers, stronger than the validation of my colleagues. It was a declaration of war, though I did not yet understand how far she was willing to go. Looking back now, I see that moment as the true beginning of the nightmare. The night my greatest achievement turned into the match that lit my sister's fury. It was past midnight when the house settled into its uneasy silence, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes the ticking of the clock sound louder than it should. I was in the kitchen sipping a glass of water, reviewing notes for the research project when I heard the sharp sound of heels against the hardwood floor. Madison appeared in the doorway, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the hallway light. Her eyes glinted with something I could not name, but the smile on her face was not a smile of peace. She stepped closer, her voice low and mocking. "So Naomi's still riding high on your little victory." My throat tightened. I did not want to argue. I whispered, "It is not little Madison. This project could save lives." She laughed, a cold sound that made my skin prickle. "Save lives," she repeated, "or save your ego. You think a piece of paper makes you better than me." I shook my head, feeling exhaustion in my bones. This is not about being better, it is about doing something meaningful. But her steps quickened, her presence suddenly towering over me. "Do you know what it is like," she hissed, "to watch you act like some savior while everyone still looks at me for perfection? You should have stayed in your place." My pulse raced. I could feel the shift, the weight of danger pressing in, and I backed away, pressing against the counter. Madison's hands twitched at her sides, restless, hungry for an action. She turned abruptly, her eyes locking on a bottle of rubbing alcohol that sat on the counter from where I had cleaned a cut earlier. I saw the spark in her expression, and my stomach dropped. "Madison, stop," I whispered, my voice shaking, but she was already unscrewing the cap, the sharp smell filling the kitchen. She grabbed a rag from the sink, doused it, and with a look of triumph in her eyes, she flung it onto the floor near my feet. The liquid spread quickly, the smell turning suffocating. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear. Then came the sound of a match striking a tiny flick that carried the power to end everything. She held it up, her smile feral. "Better off dead," she muttered, and in one motion she dropped it. Flames erupted, a whoosh of heat rising around me, licking the bottom of my pajama pants, crawling up my leg. I screamed, a raw sound that tore my throat as the fire caught the edge of my sleeve. I slapped at it desperately, but the flames spread faster than my panic. The heat seared my skin, the smell of burning fabric mixed with something worse, something that made bile rise in my throat. Madison stood back, her face pale but determined, watching. My screams must have woken Harold because he appeared at the door, his expression unreadable. For one fleeting second, I thought he might grab a fire extinguisher, that he might help me. Instead, his voice cut through the chaos, sharp and cold. "Do not call the police. Handle it yourselves." His words landed like a second blow. Donna rushed in, then her face frozen in horror. She grabbed a blanket, hesitated, then threw it over me, smothering the flames enough to stop the spread. My body convulsed with pain, every nerve ending on fire, even after the flames were out. My skin felt raw, alive with agony, patches blistered and red, my vision blurred, tears mixing with smoke. I gasped, my chest heaving, trying to understand what had just happened. Madison's voice broke through, harsh and trembling. "She was supposed to die!" She spat, her mask cracking with rage. Harold shot her a warning glance, his jaw tight. Donna knelt by me, her hands trembling, but she did not reach for her phone. Instead, she whispered frantically, "We will say it was an accident, Naomi, the stove a spill something." I tried to speak, but the words choked in my throat. The betrayal sliced deeper than the burns. My own mother was already weaving lies while I lay shaking in pain. They dragged me toward the car, Harold lifting me with rough hands, the smell of smoke clinging to everything. Every bump in the ride sent agony shooting through me. Donna kept murmuring, "Just hold on, Naomi, just hold on." But her tone was not comfort. It was desperation to control the story. At the hospital, the bright lights blinded me. Nurses rushed forward, shouting for a burn unit, calling for IVs and oxygen. I caught glimpses of their faces, wide eyes, urgent movements, the sharp scent of antiseptic battling with the smoke still clinging to me. A doctor asked what had happened, his voice steady but probing. Harold answered first, his voice clipped. "Kitchen accident," he said. "Stove flare up." Donna nodded quickly, adding, "She spilled alcohol near the stove, careless." Their lies rolled off their tongues, smoothly rehearsed even in the chaos. The doctor frowned, his eyes scanning the burns, but he said nothing more in that moment. I was wheeled away, my screams echoing down the sterile halls. In the blur of morphine and bandages, I drifted in and out of consciousness. But one image seared itself into my mind even more than the fire itself. Madison standing in the kitchen, her hand still trembling from striking that match. her lips mouthing words that burned colder than any flame. Better off dead. When I finally slipped into darkness, it was not just from the pain, it was from the crushing weight of knowing my family had chosen to cover for her. They had not chosen me. They had chosen silence, lies, and control. That night, as machines beeped steadily beside me and my body lay broken, I realized the house I had called family was nothing more than a prison, and the people inside it would rather see me destroyed than see me shine. Darkness had a weight, and I carried it for 10 endless days. When I finally surfaced, the first thing I heard was the rhythmic beeping of machines, steady and cold. My throat was raw, every breath scratching against my lungs, and my skin felt tight beneath layers of bandages. My eyes fluttered open to sterile white light and the faint hum of voices beyond a curtain. For a moment, I thought maybe it had been a nightmare, that my sister had not really struck a match, that my body had not really burned. But then, the pain hit like a wave, searing, throbbing, unrelenting. I tried to move a small shift of my hand, and agony shot through my arm, reminding me that the scars were real. A nurse appeared, her eyes widening as she saw me awake. "Welcome back, Naomi," she said softly, as if speaking to a fragile child. I forced the words out. "How long?" 10 days, she replied gently. "You were in a medically induced coma." My chest tightened. 10 days lost to darkness. 10 days where my life balanced on a thread. My first thought was not about myself, but about who had been here. Did my family sit at my side? Did they whisper words of comfort? I whispered, "My mother. Did she come?" The nurse hesitated, her lips pressing together. "She called once early on, but she has not been here." My voice cracked. "My sister!" The nurse looked away, her silence louder than any answer. Finally, she said, "No visits from her either." It was like a second burn, invisible but deeper, scorching into the core of who I was. "Even Harold?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head. "No one. Only your medical team." I turned my head toward the ceiling, the sterile panels above me swimming in my vision. The betrayal cut sharper than the fire. I had nearly died, and the people who should have fought for me, who should have begged for my survival, had abandoned me like a burden. The nurse placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Rest," she whispered. But rest felt impossible when every breath carried the weight of being unwanted. Days blurred into each other. Doctors checked my wounds, changed dressings, adjusted IV drips. They spoke clinically, measuring percentages of skin damage, discussing grafts and therapies. But between their words, I listened for footsteps that never came. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, for Donna's face to appear, for Madison to stand awkwardly at the foot of the bed, for Harold to at least offer his cold nod. The door stayed shut. One afternoon, Dr. Susan Price. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, softened by compassion, entered. She had overseen much of my care, and she pulled up a chair beside me. "Naomi," she said, "I want you to know something. Your family has told the staff that what happened was an accident. They said you spilled alcohol near the stove." I shook my head violently, the pain flaring across my neck. "No," I whispered, "it was not an accident." I saw her pause, her gaze steady. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I believe you. The burns do not align with their story. But officially, we have to record what the Guardians reported." Guardians. The word hit me hard. Donna had claimed guardianship while I was in a coma. My own voice was missing from my own story. Dr. Price reached out, brushing her hand against mine carefully. "I will document everything I can. When you are stronger, we can revisit this." She stood, then her presence leaving warmth in the coldest room of my life. That night, the door opened. My heart leapt, foolishly hopeful. Madison stepped inside. Her heels clicked softly on the tile, her perfume cutting through the sterile air. She stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, lips twisted. "Still clinging to life, huh?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. My throat tightened. "Why are you here?" She leaned closer. Her words meant for me alone. "To remind you," she said, "that you are holding everyone back." Then softer, crueler, she whispered, "Better off dead." Her smile widened as she watched the tears sting my eyes. Then she straightened, turned, and walked out, her footsteps fading. The room felt colder when she left. My heart pounded fury, mixing with despair. She had not come to comfort me. She had come to gloat, to threaten to make sure I knew my place. I clenched the sheet with trembling fingers, rage simmering beneath the pain. That night alone, I stared at the ceiling and promised myself something. They wanted me erased, but I would not be erased. I would rise, even if it meant dragging every scar with me. The first sign that something was wrong beyond the burns came a week after I regained consciousness. I had asked the nurse for my wallet to check my bank card, wanting to feel some control again, but when I tried to pay for a small charge at the hospital cafeteria, the transaction failed. I thought it was a mistake. Later that evening, I opened the banking app on my phone with shaking hands. The screen flashed red, account frozen. My pulse quickened, my chest tightening as if a new fire had started. I called the bank, my voice still hoarse from the damage to my throat, and the representative explained calmly, "A court order has frozen your funds pending guardianship review." Guardianship review. The words rang in my head like a verdict. How could there be a guardianship when I was awake speaking alive? I whispered, "Who requested this?" The voice on the other end hesitated before answering. "According to the documents, your mother and stepfather filed the petition with medical support claiming you are incapacitated." My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the phone. Incapacitated. My own family was painting me as incompetent while I lay in bed recovering. And then it clicked. Madison. The smirk on her face when she had visited the cruel whisper that I was better off dead. It had all been groundwork. She wanted control, and she had already set the pieces in motion. That night, Dr. Price came in to check my chart. I asked her directly, "Is there paperwork about my capacity?" She sighed, sitting down. "Yes, Naomi. I found additional notes in your file suggesting extended neurological issues that you may not fully recover. But these entries do not match my own evaluations. They were added later. Someone tampered with your medical records." My stomach churned. Who could do that? She met my gaze firmly. Only someone with legal access, or someone who convinced staff through influence. I knew then it had Harold's fingerprints. He had always had connections, always pulled strings when it suited him. And with Madison pushing, it was too easy. They were trying to erase me from my own future. Days later, Ethan Wells appeared at the hospital. He was my ex, someone I had once trusted before our paths diverged, but when he walked in with concern etched on his face, I felt a flicker of relief. He sat beside me, his voice low. "Naomi, I have been hearing things at the bank where Madison works. She is telling people she is handling your research contract now. She is acting like she owns it." My body stiffened. $2 million, my years of work in her hands. I whispered, "But it is mine. The contract is in my name." Ethan shook his head. "Not anymore, at least not if they succeed. She filed paperwork claiming you cannot manage it. She has been bragging to colleagues about stepping in." I could not breathe. My chest tightened, my burned skin itching under the bandages. I thought of every night coding every patient who could be helped, every sacrifice I had made. Now Madison was parading around as if she had done it all. Ethan leaned closer. "I do not trust her. She is hiding something." I wanted to cry, but tears felt like weakness and I had none left to give. Instead, I clenched my fists, ignoring the sting of my healing skin. I whispered, "Then I will fight her." But how? I had no money, no control, and my body was broken. The following morning, Donna finally appeared. She stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, her expression not of worry, but of irritation. "You are making this hard, Naomi," she said flatly. "We are trying to take care of things. You need to rest. Let Madison handle your contract. You are in no condition to manage it." My voice cracked with anger. "It is mine, Mother!" She flinched at the word, perhaps because I rarely used it anymore. Her eyes narrowed. "You always make everything difficult. Madison is the one who can carry this family's reputation. You only bring shame." I stared at her, heat rising not from burns, but from betrayal. Shame. That was what she saw when she looked at me, her own daughter lying in bandages. Harold entered, then his heavy steps shaking the floor. He set a document on the tray beside my bed. "Sign this," he said firmly. "It is power of attorney. Madison will manage your affairs until you recover." My heart thundered. I whispered, "No." His eyes darkened. "You are not thinking clearly. Do not fight us." Donna placed a hand on his arm as if to soothe him, but her eyes glinted with steel. They were united against me. My refusal enraged them, but it also planted a seed. They would not get my signature willingly, so they had forged it. Later that night, Dr. Price returned carrying copies of my file. "Naomi, she said someone submitted these forms with your signature, but I know it is not yours." The handwriting is inconsistent. My stomach dropped. They had gone that far, falsifying my signature, falsifying my capacity. I felt trapped in a nightmare that would not end. The next day, whispers followed me in the hallway when nurses thought I could not hear. "That is the patient whose family says she cannot recover." "Poor thing," one said. "She will never be the same." Their pity stung almost as much as their doubt. Madison's plan was working. The narrative was spreading. She was positioning herself as the savior while painting me as broken beyond repair. My skin might have been healing, but my life was being stolen piece by piece. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, plotting. I could not let them win. They had the money, the connections, the lies, but I had the truth. And even if the truth was buried under forged papers and altered records, I knew I would find a way to dig it out. The night after Harold shoved those papers toward me, demanding my signature, I lay in the hospital bed with the faint glow of the monitors painting the room in sterile light and made a promise to myself. They thought they had cornered me, but they had underestimated how much strength anger could give to someone who had already survived fire. My body was weak, my skin wrapped in bandages, but my mind was sharpening like steel. I could not fight them with money or influence, but I could fight them with proof. The first chance came quicker than I expected. Madison returned a few days later, strolling into the hospital room in her pressed suit, her perfume sharp and suffocating. She perched on the edge of the chair, crossing her legs, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How are we feeling today, little sister?" I forced myself to keep my voice even though my heart hammered. "I will recover." She leaned closer, her lips twisting. "Do not fool yourself. That contract is as good as mine now. Everyone at the company sees me as the one in charge. You should thank me for keeping your name alive at all." I kept my face blank, though rage surged inside me. I let her talk, nodding slightly, letting her gloat. My fingers brushed the small recorder hidden beneath my blanket, something Ethan had smuggled in for me after I told him what was happening. One-party consent law in Colorado meant I could record her freely, and I knew I needed her to expose herself. I asked quietly, "So you are telling people the project is yours?" She smirked proud. "Of course I am. Who would trust a burned invalid?" The words sliced, but I swallowed the pain. Instead, I whispered, "And you think you can get away with it?" Her eyes glittered. "I already have." The recorder captured every poisonous word. When she finally left smug and satisfied, I clutched the device like a lifeline. Proof. That was the beginning. The next step was finding allies. "Dr." Price came in later that night, her voice low and urgent. "Naomi, I reviewed your medical file again. There are alterations, false notes about permanent incapacity, and I am certain they were added after the fact. I have the logs that show who accessed the file. It lines up with a Dr. Harold knows." My stomach clenched, fury boiling. So they had bribed someone to rewrite my condition. She nodded firmly. "I will testify when the time comes." Her conviction gave me hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. Ethan, too, refused to let me fight alone. He visited when he could, bringing updates from the outside. One afternoon, he sat at my bedside with his laptop open. "Look at this," he said, his tone grim. He pulled up emails he had managed to obtain from a sympathetic coworker at the bank. In them, Madison bragged to her boss about how she was stepping into my role, how she was shaping the research deal into something more profitable. My jaw clenched as I read the words. She was erasing me on paper, rewriting history while my skin still healed. Ethan shook his head in disgust. "She has no shame." He scrolled further, showing another email chain where she referred to me as a liability. Each sentence felt like another strike, but each was also another nail in her coffin. Still, I knew it was not enough to have whispers and suspicions. We needed a full investigation. That was when Clara Mitchell entered the picture. She was a young attorney with a sharp mind and a reputation for standing up for victims of financial exploitation. When she came into my room for the first time, her suit slightly wrinkled from long hours, she extended her hand and said, "I believe you. Tell me everything." I poured it all out, my voice trembling but steady. The fire, the abandonment, the forged papers, the frozen accounts. She listened without interruption, her eyes narrowing with focus. When I finished, she leaned back. "We have a case. It will not be easy, but the evidence you have, the recording, the altered medical records, the emails, it is strong." She promised to represent me, and for the first time since the fire, I felt I had someone firmly in my corner. The investigation deepened quickly. Clara connected with a private investigator, a woman named Laura, who had a reputation for unearthing hidden truths. Laura met me one evening, her demeanor no nonsense. "I have been looking into Madison's finances," she said, spreading out documents across the small tray at my bedside. "There are transfers from her personal account to a hospital staff member, $10,000 suspicious timing, right after your admission." My chest tightened. Proof of the bribe. Laura continued. "She also wired smaller amounts to a colleague at your company. That colleague has been forging documents, making it look like Madison was the lead developer. The betrayal twisted deeper, but the evidence piled higher. Every piece of proof was like oxygen to me, fueling my resolve. I began to catalog everything, keeping a journal beside my bed, writing down dates, names, quotes. Even when my hands trembled from the pain, I forced myself to document. I knew one day these notes would matter. I thought often of Madison's face when she had said, "Better off dead." I imagined playing that line in front of a judge. The thought gave me strength, but resistance was not just about gathering evidence. It was about reclaiming my voice. I started therapy sessions at the hospital, not just for the burns, but for my spirit. The therapist asked me, "Why do you think your family acts this way?" I swallowed hard and answered, "Because my success threatens their story." For years, they convinced themselves I was less, and if I prove otherwise, their whole narrative collapses. Saying it out loud was like breaking a chain. It reminded me that their cruelty was not proof of my worthlessness. It was proof of their fear. The days turned into weeks, and with Clara and Ethan's help, I began to feel less like a victim and more like a strategist. Clara drafted filings, carefully laying out the fraud and conspiracy. Ethan kept bringing updates from the outside, recording snippets of gossip Madison spread at work. Dr. Price prepared her official statement, meticulously documenting the discrepancies in my medical file. Every ally around me became part of my small army. Of course, the pressure from my family escalated. Harold visited once more, his voice low and threatening. "Stop this nonsense, Naomi. Do you really want to drag the family through court? Sign the papers. Let Madison handle things." I met his gaze, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "No." His jaw tightened, but he left without another word. That night, I wrote in my journal. Saying no was the first time I felt free. The emotional roller coaster was relentless. Some days I felt unstoppable, imagining the courtroom, imagining Madison's mask breaking. Other days I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, consumed by fear that their power would overwhelm me. But each low was followed by a high, and I learned to ride the undulation, to let the pain fuel my determination. One evening, Ethan whispered to me, "You are stronger than any of them. They have money, but you have truth." I held on to those words. They became my mantra. By the time Clara declared we had enough to file a lawsuit, I felt like a soldier armed with scars instead of armor. My family thought the fire would silence me forever, but it had forged me into something they could not extinguish. The resistance was no longer quiet. It was building toward something public, something that would strip away their lies. And in the stillness of my hospital room, with the scent of antiseptic in the air and the faint burn marks still etched into my skin, I knew the war was only just beginning. The day of the trial arrived with a chill in the Denver air, the kind that seeped into bones and whispered that something irreversible was about to unfold. I stood outside the courthouse leaning heavily on my crutches, the weight of my scars hidden beneath long sleeves but pulsing beneath the fabric like a truth that could not be buried. Clara stood beside me, her briefcase in one hand, her other hand gently steadying me as we faced the towering building. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I nodded, though my stomach churned. I had been ready since the night Madison whispered Better off dead into the smoke-filled kitchen. Inside the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters sat with notebooks poised, colleagues from my hospital and company filled the benches, and curious strangers leaned forward, eager to witness the unraveling of a family. On the opposite side sat Madison, her hair perfectly styled, her suit sharp, but her eyes darted nervously. Harold sat rigid, jaw clenched, while Donna fidgeted, wringing her hands. They looked like a family under siege, but I knew they had walked willingly into this fire. When the judge entered, silence fell. We all rose, and as I lowered myself back into the chair, the crutches clattering against the wood, I felt the eyes of the entire room settle on me. For the first time in my life, I did not feel invisible. I felt powerful. Clara rose, her voice clear and firm. "Your Honor, this case is about more than money. It is about a conspiracy to erase my client, Naomi Carter, from her own life. It is about attempted murder disguised as accident and fraud disguised as guardianship. We will prove that the defendants not only abandoned her, but actively sought to profit from her suffering." The words hung in the air like thunder. The judge gestured for her to proceed. Clara began with the recording. The audio crackled to life, my sister's voice cold and cutting. "Of course I am taking the contract!" Madison's voice rang. Who would trust a burned invalid? Gasps spread across the gallery. I watched as Madison's face drained of color, her polished mask slipping. Clara let the words echo, then calmly stopped the playback. "This," she said, "is the voice of someone who admitted not only to stealing credit, but to reducing her own sister's survival to an inconvenience." Next came the emails Ethan had helped uncover. Clara displayed them on the screen, Madison writing to colleagues claiming leadership of the algorithm, dismissing me as incapacitated. Each email stacked against her like bricks, forming a wall of guilt. Madison shifted in her chair, whispering furiously to her attorney, but the damage was done. The jury leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. Then came the financial records Laura had traced. Clara held them up with precision. "These transfers show payments from Madison's account to a hospital employee timed exactly with the alterations in Naomi's medical records." The implication was undeniable. Madison had paid to rewrite my prognosis to justify taking control of my life and work. The courtroom murmured outrage rippling through the benches. Dr. Price took the stand next. Her voice was steady, her professionalism shining as she laid out the discrepancies. "The medical entries claiming permanent incapacity were false," she explained. "They did not match the clinical reality of Naomi's recovery. These alterations were deliberate, and they served only to support the guardianship petition filed by her family." She concluded with quiet conviction. Naomi was never incapacitated to the degree described. She was healing, but she was never incapable of making decisions for herself. The judge nodded gravely, her eyes lingering on me. I felt tears sting not from weakness, but from the validation of being seen, finally seen. Then it was Madison's turn. She took the stand, her posture stiff, her voice sharp. "I did what I had to do," she declared. "Naomi was unstable. She could not manage $2 million in research funding while lying in a hospital bed. I stepped in to protect her interests, to protect the company." Clara's questions sliced through her defense like a scalpel. Protect her by calling her a burned invalid. Protect her by bribing doctors. Protect her by forging documents. Madison's voice faltered, her eyes flashing with desperation. "I was keeping things afloat," she insisted, her voice rising. "She was supposed to die." The words slipped before she could catch them. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged the gavel, demanding silence, but the damage was irreversible. Madison had confessed the truth, raw and unfiltered. Harold tried to remain stoic when he was called, but under questioning, his lies cracked. Clara presented his connection to the bribed doctor, the phone calls, the meetings. He stammered, I only wanted to help, but the evidence of obstruction weighed heavy. Donna wept openly when asked why she supported the guardianship. She whispered, I just wanted peace. I wanted Madison happy. Her tears did not move the jury. They saw complicity, not sorrow. Finally, Clara called me to the stand. My crutches clicked against the floor as I rose, the weight of every eye on me. I swore to tell the truth, and then I told my story. I described the fire, the pain, the hospital bed where I woke alone. I told them about Madison's visit, her whisper better off dead, the lies spun in my name, the attempt to erase me. My voice shook but grew stronger with every word. They thought I would remain silent. They thought scars would make me weaker. But I am here alive because I refused to let them take what I built. The courtroom was silent when I finished, the silence heavy with truth. Madison's glare burned into me, but it no longer had power. Harold stared at the floor. Donna could not meet my eyes. For once, I held the stage they had denied me my entire life. The judge recessed briefly, and I sat back down, my body trembling, but inside, a storm of strength raged. The trial was no longer just about law. It was about exposing the cruel architecture of a family that had thrived on favoritism and control. Now stripped of their lies, they stood exposed. When the judge returned, she addressed the courtroom with solemn weight. The evidence presented is overwhelming. The defendants engaged in a deliberate scheme to defraud and to deprive Naomi Carter of her rights. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. This court recognizes not only the financial conspiracy but the attempt on her life. The gallery gasped, the words ringing with the gravity of justice. At that moment, I felt a release, as though the fire that once tried to consume me had finally burned itself out, leaving only resilience behind. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was no longer the shadow. I was the survivor who had turned their lies into their undoing. The air in the courtroom felt heavier when the judge lifted her gavel again, as though the very walls leaned in to hear what would be said next. The jury had deliberated for only 3 hours, a short span that told me the evidence had been clear. When they returned, their faces stern and unreadable, I gripped my crutches and held my breath. The foreperson rose, her voice steady as she read, We, the jury, find the defendant, Madison Carter, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of fraud, and guilty of conspiracy to defraud. Each word struck like a bell, reverberating through my bones. The foreperson continued, We find Harold Carter guilty of obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. We find Donna Carter liable for civil damages and aiding and abetting concealment. The courtroom erupted into whispers, some shocked, some satisfied, all charged with the electricity of justice finally catching up. The judge raised her hand for silence. In sentencing, she said, her voice deliberate, This court must balance the severity of the crimes with the need for accountability. She looked directly at Madison, who sat rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the defense table. Madison Carter, you orchestrated a scheme that endangered your sister's life and attempted to steal her livelihood. Your actions were deliberate, cruel, and calculated. For attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy, this court sentences you to 15 years in state prison. You will also pay restitution of $200,000 to Naomi Carter for damages caused. The gallery gasped, and Madison let out a strangled cry, her face twisting as if the sentence itself burned. She shook her head violently, whispering, No, this is not real. But the bailiff moved closer, ready to escort her away. The judge turned to Harold. You enabled this conspiracy. You stood by while your stepdaughter burned and then chose lies over compassion. For obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, I sentence you to 5 years probation with strict community supervision, mandatory counseling, and a permanent record of your actions. Harold's jaw clenched, but his shoulders sagged, as though the weight of his downfall finally settled onto him. The man who had once towered over me barking orders now looked small, his authority stripped by the same system he had thought he could manipulate. Then the judge turned to Donna, who sat trembling, tears streaming down her face. Donna Carter, While you did not strike the match, your silence and your willingness to protect your elder daughter over your younger contributed directly to Naomi's suffering. For aiding and abetting concealment, you are held civilly liable. You will pay damages of $100,000. Donna sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands, but the judgment was final. When the sentences were read, a hush fell. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a ripple of emotion spread through the room. Some spectators nodded in satisfaction, others shook their heads in disbelief, but all eyes eventually found me. I sat upright, my scars visible beneath the courtroom lights, my grip on the crutches steady. I did not smile. I did not gloat. Instead, I let the relief wash over me like cool water on skin that had been burning for months. Madison was led away in handcuffs, her designer suit wrinkled, her hair falling out of its perfect style. She glanced back at me once her eyes filled with venom and desperation. "You ruined me," she hissed, her voice low but audible. I met her gaze and said nothing. She had ruined herself. Harold stood stiff as the bailiff informed him of the terms of his probation. For a man who had once believed control was his birthright, the thought of reporting to supervisors and attending counseling was humiliation enough. Donna could not stop crying, her sobs echoing as though she had finally realized the pedestal she had built for Madison had collapsed and crushed her as well. When the judge dismissed us, people began to file out, but I stayed seated for a moment longer. The gallery was nearly empty when I finally rose, my crutches clicking on the floor. Clara walked beside me, her face bright with quiet triumph. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "We did it." Dr. Price met me in the hallway, her eyes kind. "Justice has been served, Naomi," she said, and for once I believed it. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. The Denver sky was a clear blue, and though my scars pulled uncomfortably against my sleeves, I felt lighter. For months, I had carried the weight of betrayal, the suffocating lies, the endless pain. Now, those who had tried to silence me were silenced themselves. I did not need their approval. I had something greater: validation, truth, justice. The news spread quickly. Local papers carried headlines about the sister who tried to burn her sibling alive for control of a multi-million-dollar contract. Neighbors who had once whispered about my family's perfection now looked at us with different eyes. The golden pedestal that Madison had occupied was shattered, and Donna's image as a devoted mother was tarnished beyond repair. Harold's reputation as a respected figure collapsed. They would live under the shadow of their own choices. That night, I sat alone in my small apartment, bandages still covering parts of my skin, and let the silence settle around me. It was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of peace. I stared at my reflection, at the uneven skin, the scars that would never fade, and I whispered to myself, "You survived. They tried to erase you, but you endured. Every scar was proof not of weakness but of strength." The next morning, I visited the site where the foundation of my future would begin. With restitution funds and my contract reinstated, I signed the paperwork to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of family abuse. I wanted no one else to feel the loneliness I had felt in that hospital bed, no one else to wake up to betrayal from those who should have protected them. I named it the Phoenix Fund because, like the mythic bird, I had risen from fire. When I spoke at the launch event weeks later, my voice was steady. My story shared not with bitterness, but with purpose. Families can heal or they can destroy, I said, and when they choose destruction, survivors deserve a chance to rebuild. My scars are permanent, but so is my determination to make sure others find the support I once lacked. The audience rose in applause, and I felt the rhythm of their claps echo through me. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but healing was mine to claim outside of it. The fire had marked me forever, but it had also forged me into someone stronger than I ever knew I could be. And as I looked toward the horizon, I knew the story of betrayal and survival was no longer my prison. It was my power. The courthouse doors closed behind me for the last time, and though the Denver air was crisp and cold that morning, it tasted like freedom. The trial had ended, the sentences were handed down, and the people who had tried to erase me were now living inside the consequences of their own choices. Yet walking away from the courthouse did not mean the scars disappeared. They tugged against my skin with every movement they stared back at me from the mirror. but they also reminded me with every step that I was alive, that I had endured what should have destroyed me. I moved into a small apartment in the city. Nothing extravagant, just 2 rooms with wide windows that let in the Colorado sunlight. The walls were bare at first, but to me, they were blank pages waiting to be written on. I bought a single plant of fern and placed it on the sill, promising myself that if it thrived, so would I. At night, I would sit by the window watching the city lights flicker, and for the first time in my life, I felt no need to prove myself to anyone. I no longer sought my mother's approval, no longer craved Harold's grudging nod, no longer hoped for Madison's recognition. They had made their choices and I had made mine. But healing was not linear. There were mornings when I woke drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke still clinging to my memory. I would relive the moment the match struck, the whoosh of fire, the pain as my skin seared. My hands would tremble and I would press them to the scars on my arms, grounding myself in the present. Therapy sessions became a lifeline. My therapist listened as I poured out the tangled mess of anger, grief, and exhaustion. "You cannot change what they did," she told me gently, "but you can change what you do with what they left behind." Those words became a compass. Clara stayed in touch, checking in regularly, not as my attorney, but as a friend. She came by one evening with takeout containers, setting them on my kitchen table. "You should not eat alone tonight," she said simply. We sat together laughing over small things, and for a few hours the weight of the past lightened. Dr. Price, too, remained a presence, sending updates about burn treatments, recommending specialists. She never once treated me as broken. She treated me as a survivor. That recognition was worth more than medicine. Ethan visited often, bringing news from the outside world. He never pressured, never tried to rekindle what we had lost years ago. Instead, he stood beside me as a steady presence. Sometimes we sat in silence watching old movies. Sometimes we talked about the future. "You get to choose now," he said once. "Not them, not the past, you." I let those words sink in. Choice. That was something my family had always denied me, always trying to dictate my role. Now choice was mine. The Phoenix Fund took shape faster than I expected. With the restitution money and a portion of my research earnings, I rented a small office, hired 2 part-time staff, and opened the doors to anyone fleeing toxic families, anyone who had been silenced by control and betrayal. We offered legal referrals, counseling, temporary housing connections. The first woman who walked through our door carried bruises hidden beneath her sweater, her eyes downcast. When she looked up at me and saw my scars, she whispered, "You understand." And I did. That moment cemented my purpose. At the launch event, standing in front of donors and supporters, I told my story not as a victim, but as proof that survival was possible. "My scars are permanent," I said, "but so is my determination." The audience rose in applause, and I felt tears prick my eyes. For years, I had longed for recognition from my family. Now I realized I did not need it. Recognition from strangers who believed in my mission was far more powerful. Meanwhile, the news of the trial continued to ripple through the community. Neighbors whispered about Donna, once the image of maternal pride, now marked by complicity. Harold's reputation as a stern but respectable man crumbled. Madison's name became synonymous with greed and cruelty. I did not rejoice in their downfall, but I felt relief knowing they could no longer cast shadows over me. Their masks had shattered publicly, and I was free. Still, I carried complicated feelings. Some nights I lay awake wondering if my mother ever loved me at all, or if her love had always been conditional, reserved for the daughter who fit her ideal. I wondered if Harold ever regretted choosing silence over compassion. I wondered if Madison ever saw me as anything but a threat. The questions haunted me, but I learned not to let them anchor me. I would never have their answers. What I had instead was my own voice, and that had to be enough. One day, I stood in front of a group of nursing students at the hospital, invited to speak about resilience in healthcare. I told them about the night of the fire, the betrayal, the courtroom. But more importantly, I told them about the importance of standing firm when others try to erase you. One student raised her hand, eyes wide. "How do you keep going after all that?" I smiled softly. "You stop waiting for them to care, and you start caring for yourself." That line stayed with me long after the session ended. Months passed, and my body healed slowly. The scars would never fade completely, but skin grafts helped, and I wore them proudly. People stared sometimes, but instead of shrinking, I met their gaze. These are not marks of weakness, I would say quietly to myself, they are proof of survival. I began jogging again, my stride uneven at first, then stronger. The rhythm of my feet on the pavement was a reminder that life still pulsed through me unbroken. Ethan was there on the sidelines during my first 5K run for charity, cheering louder than anyone. When I crossed the finish line, sweat mingling with the sting of healing skin, I realized I was not running away from my past anymore. I was running into my future. The day Madison began her sentence, I felt no satisfaction, only finality. She was behind bars, Harold was under probation, Donna was paying damages. The cycle of favoritism and cruelty that had defined my childhood was broken not by reconciliation, but by exposure. Justice had been the only language they understood. On the anniversary of the fire, I lit a candle in my apartment, not for them, but for myself. I sat by the window watching the flame flicker and whispered, "You chose survival." That single act of lighting a candle in peace rather than choking on smoke and fear felt like reclaiming the fire. Life after betrayal is not clean. It is jagged, uneven, filled with moments of grief, even in victory. But I learned to embrace the unevenness. I learned that scars can coexist with joy, that justice can coexist with sorrow, that endings can coexist with beginnings. As I stood in my office months later, the Phoenix Fund bustling with activity, I realized I had finally written my own story. My family's version had been one of erasure, but mine was one of defiance. They tried to reduce me to ashes, but I had risen scarred yet unbroken, carrying not only my survival, but the hope of others. Looking out over Denver's skyline, the city that had witnessed my fall and my rise, I whispered to myself, "They wanted me gone, but I am here, and I will stay." If you have followed me this far, if you have listened to every step of this story from the night the fire almost swallowed me to the moment I stood in that courtroom with my scars uncovered, then you already know this is not just about me. This is about what it means to be silenced by those who should love you, about what it feels like to fight for breath when the people meant to protect you decide you are disposable. And I want you sitting on the other side of this screen to ask yourself a question. What would you do if the people you trusted most turned against you? Would you forgive them? Would you try to keep the peace? Or would you stand up and demand that they face the weight of their choices? When I first told this story in court, people whispered that it was too dramatic, that families are complicated and everyone makes mistakes. But betrayal is not a mistake. Abandonment is not a misunderstanding. Attempting to erase someone from their own life is not a misstep. It is a choice, a deliberate act, and those choices deserve consequences. I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because too many of us are taught to excuse cruelty just because it comes from family. Too many of us are told to swallow pain for the sake of appearances, to stay silent so that the family name stays untarnished. Silence is what almost killed me. Speaking was what saved me. If you are watching this and nodding quietly because you have felt the sting of being overlooked, because you have carried scars others could not see, then I want to tell you this. You are not invisible. You are not alone. And your story, no matter how messy, no matter how painful, has value. My scars are visible, but yours might be hidden. That does not make them any less real. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone in your own family? Have you ever been pushed aside, dismissed, or abandoned when you needed them most? I want you to comment below and share, because every story matters. This space is not just for me to speak. It is for all of us to remind each other that survival is possible, that justice is worth fighting for, that healing is not just a dream. Some of you might wonder why I chose not to forgive. Forgiveness is a word that carries weight, especially for those of us who were raised to believe that family ties are sacred. But forgiveness without accountability is just surrender. If I had forgiven without demanding justice, Madison would still be smiling in boardrooms. Harold would still be pulling strings. Donna would still be playing the doting mother in public while ignoring her silence in private. I chose not to surrender. I chose to stand. That does not mean you must make the same choice, but it means you have the right to. Do not let anyone tell you that you owe forgiveness to someone who set you on fire. I want you to imagine sitting in my shoes hearing your sister say, "Better off dead as flames consumed you." What would you do with that memory? Would you bury it, pretend it never happened, or would you stand in a courtroom and force her to hear her own words replayed? That is why I ask you now, not as a storyteller, but as someone who has lived it, what would you do? Comment below. Let us debate. Let us speak the truths our families tried to bury. To those of you who are older who have lived long lives filled with complicated family dynamics, I know this story may feel extreme, but I also know you recognize the patterns. The golden child who can do no wrong, the scapegoat who is always at fault, the mother who chooses appearances over fairness, the father or stepfather who values control over compassion. These patterns destroy quietly until one day they explode. Maybe in your family it was not fire. Maybe it was words that cut just as deep decisions that left scars no one can see. If this story resonates, if it makes your chest ache with memories, then know this channel is a place where your voice can matter. I also want to say this. Justice is not always found in courtrooms. Some of you will never see the people who hurt you behind bars. Some of you will never hear a judge declare them guilty. But justice can also be found in choosing to walk away, in refusing to let their voices define you, in building a life that is yours alone. My courtroom victory was loud, but my healing is quiet. It happens every time I water the plant on my windowsill, every time I help another survivor through the Phoenix Fund, every time I wake up and choose to keep breathing. So I ask again, if it were you, what would you do? Would you keep the peace? Would you swallow the pain? Or would you drag the truth into the light, even if it shattered everything? Comment below. Share your story. Debate it with others. Do not stay silent. And if you are watching this and thinking, you have no story, think again. We all carry something. Maybe it is small, maybe it is enormous, but silence is what keeps pain festering. Break it. Write it here. Read what others have survived. Let this not be just my story, but ours. I will leave you with this thought. My scars are permanent, but they are not my shame. They are my strength. They remind me that survival is possible even when those closest to you wish you gone. And if I can stand in front of a courtroom and face the people who wanted me erased, then you can face whatever ghosts haunt your past. So tell me, what would you do? Would you forgive? Would you fight? Would you disappear? Or would you rise? The comments are open. The debate is waiting. And your story deserves to be told.